It's that time again when we have to start an episode with a disclaimer, because today's episode is about the passing of people. I know YouTube has an issue with the word of death, so I'm a bit cautious of how I am wording it. But the episode is linked to what happens to the brain and mind at the end of life. It's a topic I find very fascinating. I'm not afraid to talk about passing of people or the end of life, but I know it can also be a heavy one for a lot of people, especially if you just recently may have lost someone. So if you lost someone recently, or if the subject is just not right for you today for listening, then I'm okay and completely agree that you maybe should not listen right now, or you should skip this episode. But it's up to you what you do. You are in charge of your life and your choices. I just didn't want to start the episode banging on straight away into the topic and kind of making people uncomfortable. So let's begin. Here is something strange. In the final minutes before someone dies, someone passes away, someone moves on to the next level, as I sometimes call it. Some brains show a sudden burst of electrical activity, almost like the brain is waking up, right as the body is shutting down. Nobody fully agrees on what it means. Some researchers think it's the brain's last coordinated act. Others think it's closer to static than signal. But here's something that gets me on the topic. Long before anyone had an EEG machine, cultures all over the world with no contact with each other were describing something oddly similar. A sense of light, a sense of presence, a feeling that something continues. So that's why I chose to sit with a question that doesn't have a straightforward answer. What actually happens to the brain and to the mind when a life ends? And why do so many different traditions, from ancient Egypt to modern Mexico to a Buddhist monastery, seem to be pointing at the same thing? Let me reassure you, though, I'm not here to tell you that there's an afterlife, and I'm not here to tell you there isn't. I'm here to look at the evidence honestly and then sit in the mystery with you for a while. Here's another question. Why would this matter for a show about brains and minds? Most of what we cover here is about the brain while it's clearly running. Attention, memory, emotion, habit. The end of the life of a person, called death, is the edge case. It is the one moment where the machinery of the brain and the experience of being someone come apart, or at least seem to come apart. And that makes it one of the most revealing puzzles in all of neuroscience, because whatever's happening here tells us something about what consciousness actually is the rest of the time too. So here is what we're looking at today. First, we'll look at what neuroscience can actually observe about the dying brain, the documented phenomena, not the speculation dressed up as fact. Then we'll step back and look at how different cultures and philosophies have made sense, or tried to make sense, of this same transition, picking a number of traditions to really sit with rather than skimming too many of those. Then we'll ask the bigger question, why do these two very different ways of knowing, lab data and lived tradition, keep landing in similar territory? And I'll finally close with some personal thoughts and observations. Another important point I would like to make is that I'm going to be careful with the science, because some of the research is genuinely solid. Some of it is early and contested, and I'll try to be honest about which is which as we go along. First, let's look at a little bit of science to do with the dying brain. Let's start with something called terminal lucidity. This is a well-documented but poorly understood phenomenon when people with advanced dementia or who've been unresponsive for days suddenly become clear, present and articulate, sometimes just hours before they die. Family members describe a parent who hadn't recognized anyone in months, suddenly calling them by name, talking normally, even joking. Nobody knows exactly why this happens. Some researchers think it might be a final, unusual burst of coordinated brain activity, almost like a system finding one last surge of resources before it powers down. Others suspect it's connected to shifts in blood flow or brain chemistry in the final hours. What makes it interesting scientifically is that it doesn't fit our usual model of neurodegeneration as a one-way, irreversible decline. Something about the ending doesn't behave the way the middle did. Then there's the gamma wave research. Gamma waves are a fast type of brain activity that's usually associated with focused attention and vivid conscious experience. In a small number of studies, including some using EEG monitoring on patients as they died, researchers observed a spike in this kind of activity around the time of death. In some cases, even after the heart has stopped. It's tempting to read a lot into that. Some have suggested it's the brain generating one final vivid conscious experience. But I want to be careful here. The sample sizes are small. The conditions are hard to standardize, and correlation between gamma wave present and person having an experience is not the same as proof. It's a genuinely interesting finding. It's not a settled one. And then there's the most talked about phenomenon, near-death experiences or NDEs. People who have been resuscitated after cardiac arrest or come close to death in other ways often report strikingly similar experiences. A sense of moving through a tunnel towards light, a feeling of profound peace, a life review where memories seem to play back, sometimes a sense of meeting someone or something. What's notable is how consistent these reports are across different cultures, ages, and belief systems. Science has a few candidate explanations. One is oxygen deprivation in the brain, which is known to produce unusual visual and emotional experiences. Another points to REM sleep intrusion, essentially dreamlike processes leaking into waking consciousness during extreme physiological stress. Some researchers have pointed to the fact that DMT, a naturally occurring compound in the brain, produces subjectively similar effects when administered directly, which has led to speculation about a release of DMT-like activity during dying. None of these explanations are fully proven, and none of them are mutually exclusive. It might be some combination of all three or something we haven't identified yet. So, what does NDE research actually give us beyond a list of strange stories? A few things, possibly. First, it's changed how seriously resuscitation science takes consciousness near death at all. Large hospital studies following cardiac arrest patients, monitoring brain activity during and after resuscitation, have moved this from folklore into something clinicians are willing to measure and publish on. That alone is a shift. 20 years ago, this was mostly treated as anecdote. Now it's a live area of research with its own methodology and its own disagreements. Second, the live review phenomenon, where people report a rapid, vivid replay of memories, has genuinely interesting parallels to how we understand memory consolidation elsewhere in the brain. It raises a real question. Is a dying brain doing something like an accelerated, extreme version of ordinary memory processes, just compressed and intensified? That's a testable-ish idea, even if we're a long way from testing it well. Third, NDE research has quietly become useful in palliative and end-of-life care. Clinicians who take these reports seriously, rather than dismissing them, often find that patients and families are less afraid and more at peace when their experiences are acknowledged as real and worth discussing, regardless of what's ultimately causing them. In that sense, this research has practical value in the room with a dying person, even where the underlying neuroscience is still unsettled. And finally, it keeps consciousness researchers honest about the limits of current tools. NDEs happen in conditions, extreme physiological stress, sometimes flat or near flat brain activity, and that our test monitoring methods weren't built to capture in real time. That gap between what we can measure and what people report experiencing is exactly where the next generation of consciousness research is aimed. And here is where to land this segment. The honest scientific position is that we can describe some of the physical correlates of dying pretty well. What we cannot yet do is to settle what, if anything, is being experienced during that process, or what that experience means. That's not a failure of science. It's just an unusually hard problem, because the only people who could report back on it are, by definitions, the ones we've lost the ability to ask. So if science gives us careful, partial answers, what do the world's cultures and philosophies offer? Let's walk through 8 different ways humans have tried to make sense of this. In Buddhist traditional teachings from Tibet, there's a concept called the bardo. An intermediate state consciousness is said to pass through after the passing or death, before rebirth. It's described in incredible detail in what's often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which functions almost like a guide read about to help the dying and the recently deceased navigate this transition. What I find philosophically interesting here isn't just the cosmology, it's the underlying claim that consciousness doesn't have a hard off switch. It's treated as a process with phases, not a light that simply goes out. In Hindu philosophical traditions, particularly Vedanta, there's the concept of the Atman, an essential self or consciousness that's understood to be distinct from the body and mind altogether. Death, or the passing, in this view, isn't the end of the Atman. It is a shedding of one temporary vessel before continuing on, whether that's through reincarnation or, for a few, towards liberation or moksha from the cycle entirely. What's philosophically interesting here is the very sharp distinction drawn between consciousness and the machinery that carries it, a split that modern philosophy of mind still argues about under different names. The ancient Egyptians didn't think of you as one single thing. They described several components. The Ka, a kind of life force, the Ba, closer to personality or individual character, and the Ak, spelled AKH, the transfigured spirit that could exist in the afterlife. At death, these were understood to separate and each follow its own path. What's striking is how this maps onto a genuinely modern idea that the self isn't one unified thing, but several separate processes running together, which is not far off from how some neuroscientists today describe consciousness as an integration of otherwise distinct brain functions. In Yoruba cosmology and related West African traditions, the dead aren't separated from the living so much as repositioned within an ongoing family and community structure. Ancestors are understood to remain active, consulted, honored, sometimes appealed to for guidance, rather than existing in some distant, disconnected realm. It's a framework where identity and relationship don't end with the body. The social mind, in a sense, persists. And there's a Mexican tradition, the Mexican Dia de los Muertos. This tradition treats death very differently from a lot of Western defaults. Rather than framing death as an ending or an absence, it frames it as a continued relationship. Families build altars, share food, and welcome the dead back for a visit once a year. The mind of the person who died isn't gone in this framework. It's just in a different kind of contact with the living. Grief here isn't only about loss, it's paired with ongoing connection. In Celtic tradition, particularly Irish folklore, there's the idea of thin places, locations, and sometimes moments in time where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead is thought to become porous. Death here isn't imagined as a wall, but as a permeable membrane, and certain times of year, like Samhain, I hope I pronounced that right, the Irish people, were specifically understood as periods when the membrane thinned further. It's a strikingly spatial way of thinking about a transition we usually only think of in temporal terms, not just when someone passes or dies, but where the living and the dead momentarily meet. Next is a perspective from the indigenous people of the Americas, and it's worth saying up front that Native American covers hundreds of distinct nations, each with their own distinct traditions. So this is a narrow window rather than a single unified view. That said, a theme that recurs across many of these traditions is the idea of death as a journey along a path or road the spirit travels, often guided by ancestors or spirit helpers towards a further world that remains connected to the living rather than sealed off from it. Many traditions also emphasize right relationship and balance, the idea that how a person lived and how the living continues to honor them matters for how that journey unfolds. It's less a single doctrine and more a shared emphasis of death as relational and ongoing rather than final and isolating. In Hawaiian tradition, there's the concept of the uhane, a spirit or soul understood to be distinct from the body, which at death is believed to leave and journey onward, sometimes to a leaping off point associated with a specific sacred place. Ancestors, or the aumakua, are understood to become guardian spirits, sometimes taking the form of an animal who continue to watch over and guide their living descendants. Across wider Polynesian cultures, there's a similar through line. Death transforms someone's role rather than erasing it, folding them into an ongoing web of guidance and family obligations that continues across generations. Japan offers a genuinely interesting case because most people there aren't operating from a single tradition but a blend of two. Shinto belief holds that the dead can become kami, spirits or deities associated with places, nature or ancestry who remain part of the living world rather than departing from it. Layered on top of that, Buddhist practice contributes structured rituals for the dead, including memorial services held at set intervals after the passing or death, reflecting the idea that the transition to full ancestorhood is itself a gradual process rather than an instant one. The household altar, or butsudan, keeps this relationship active day to day. Death here is treated less as a single event and more as a transition that continues to be tended to over years. Jumping now to ancient Greece and Rome, the Stoics, particularly thinkers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, framed death not as a tragedy, but as a natural transformation, the same as any other change in nature. Their argument was roughly this: you don't fear the state you were in before you were born, so why fear returning to that same kind of non-being? It's a colder, more logic-driven answer than the others, but it's had enormous staying power precisely because it doesn't require any belief in continuation at all. It's death acceptance without an afterlife attached. And to round off all this cultural perspective, I want to include one modern, a largely secular perspective, because it's easy to think this is only an ancient versus science divide. Hospice and palliative care workers who spend enormous amounts of time with dying patients have increasingly pushed back on purely mechanical descriptions of dying. Many report witnessing things like terminal lucidity or vivid pre-death experiences constantly and argue these deserve to be taken seriously as clinically real phenomena with documenting, without needing to attach a specific metaphysical explanation to them. It's a perspective that sits right in between the lab and the temple. So looking at all these different perspectives from different cultures and what we said at the very beginning, we get to a question. Why do so many of these traditions, developed independently across thousands of miles and thousands of years, keep circling the same handful of ideas? Light, presence, continuity, a sense that the ending isn't a hard stop. There could be a few honest ways to explain that convergence, and I don't think we have to pick just one. One possibility is shared neurobiology. If human brains are wired similarly enough, then extreme physiological states oxygen deprivation, massive neurochemical shifts, a dying nervous system might just reliably produce similar subjective experiences in anyone, regardless of culture. In that view, the similarity isn't spiritual, it's just biology behaving consistently. A second possibility is shared psychological need. Humans across every culture have to cope with the same brutal fact: everyone they love and they themselves will pass away or die. It is plausible that separate cultures independently developed similar comforting narratives, continuity, presence, light, simply because those are the kinds of stories that help a mind survive grief and mortality, regardless of whether they're literally true. And the third possibility, the one that's hardest to sit with, is that we genuinely don't know. It's possible there's something about consciousness at this threshold that current science hasn't mapped, and that these converged human reports are pointing at something real that we don't yet have the tools to describe. I'm not going to pretend that's a scientific conclusion. It isn't. But intellectual honesty means admitting that we don't fully understand this yet. It's a legitimate place to end up. We do not need to know everything. It might be an idea to sit with that. We do not need to know everything, and maybe it is better that we don't know everything. What strikes me personally most isn't any single data point or any single tradition. It's the pattern across all of them. However differently humans have described this moment, almost nobody describes it as simply nothing, whether that's biology, psychology, or something we haven't figured out yet, or will never figure out. Maybe that's better. I find that worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly or at all. In a way, at the end of the episode, I hope it got you thinking what we were looking at today. The two very different ways of knowing, the careful data of neuroscience and the deep patterns of human tradition from all the different corners of the world, both circling the same mystery from different directions. Rather interesting. There are phenomena that can't be explained, and I think it's good that they can't be explained. And that brings us to the end of the August episode of Exploring Brain and Mind. I hope you find the topic interesting, and if you did, share the episode with others. Follow and subscribe on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, Amazon Music, and tune in again next month, early September, when the next episode comes out. Thanks for listening.